The Baltic region, stretching from Lithuania in the south through Latvia to Estonia in the north, had been under German occupation since the summer of 1941. Incorporated into the Reichskommissariat Ostland, the territories were treated as both a resource base and a strategic outpost for the German war effort. The region's ports on the Baltic Sea gave the Kriegsmarine access to vital naval bases, while the flat terrain provided defensive depth for the Wehrmacht's northern wing. At the same time, the area was politically sensitive. The Baltic states had been independent between the world wars, then annexed by the Soviet Union in 1940, and occupied by Germany a year later. By 1944, the civilian population had endured years of shifting control, conscription, deportations, and partisan warfare. The military balance in the Baltic changed fundamentally in 1943 and after the German defeat at Kursk in July 1943 and the loss of Smolensk. The front line in the north became increasingly unstable. Soviet forces advanced toward the Daugava River and the borders of the Baltic states, while the Germans attempted to hold the line with Army Group North. By early 1944, this formation consisted of two main field armies, the 16th and 18th Armies, along with elements of the 3rd Panzer Army on its southern flank. Altogether, Army Group North numbered around 730,000 soldiers, supported by 700 tanks and assault guns, and approximately 800 aircraft under Luftflotte 1. These forces were stretched thin along a broad front, extending from Lake Peipus in Estonia to the boundary with Army Group Center in Belarus. The Soviet side had undergone a profound transformation since the disasters of 1941-42. The Red Army had rebuilt its strength, modernized its structure, and improved its logistics. In 1944, the Stavka assigned three powerful fronts to the Baltic theater: the First Baltic Front under General Ivan Bagramyan, the Second Baltic Front under General Andrei Eremenko, and the Third Baltic Front under General Ivan Maslenikov. Combined, these forces fielded over 1.5 million men, nearly 3,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, 20,000 artillery pieces and mortars, and more than 2,000 aircraft. Their mission was to eliminate Army Group North, liberate the Baltic states, and secure the northern flank of the Red Army's advance into East Prussia. The geopolitical importance of the region was evident to both sides. For Germany, the Baltics represented a buffer protecting East Prussia and the approaches to the Reich itself. The ports of Riga, Liepāja, Tallinn, and others provided bases for U-boats and surface vessels operating in the Baltic Sea, as well as crucial supply lines to Finland, a co-belligerent against the Soviet Union. Retaining control of the region also allowed the Wehrmacht to maintain contact with Finland's forces on the Karelian Isthmus. For the Soviet Union, recapturing the Baltic states would not only secure a direct line to East Prussia, but also reassert Soviet political authority over territories annexed in 1940. Politically, Stalin was determined that these republics should not regain independence or fall under German influence once the war turned. The population of the Baltics, numbering around 6 million across the three republics, had little control over its fate. Since 1941, German occupation authorities had exploited the region's resources for the Reich. Thousands of young men were conscripted into auxiliary units or deported for labor service in Germany. At the same time, nationalist resistance movements and Soviet partisans fought against German occupation, often with brutal reprisals against civilians. By 1944, the civilian population faced the prospect of another wave of destruction as the front approached. Intelligence assessments on both sides reinforced the urgency of the situation. German commanders recognized that Army Group North could be cut off if the Red Army advanced rapidly through Belarus and Lithuania. Soviet planners, meanwhile, calculated that German strength in the Baltics was insufficient to withstand a concentrated offensive, especially once Army Group Center began collapsing under Operation Bagration in the summer of 1944. The Baltic offensive thus became part of a larger strategic design, the destruction of German forces across the entire Eastern Front in a coordinated series of blows. As the summer of 1944 approached, the conditions for a decisive Soviet advance were firmly in place. The Red Army was preparing to unleash. The Germans were overstretched, short of reserves, and operating under Hitler's rigid orders to hold every position. The stage was set for one of the most significant Soviet offensives of the war in the north, the campaign that would push the Red Army to the Baltic Sea and isolate hundreds of thousands of German troops in the Courland Peninsula. In June 1944, the balance of power on the Eastern Front shifted dramatically. Operation Bagration shattered Army Group Center in Belarus, annihilating dozens of German divisions and driving the Wehrmacht into retreat. This collapse exposed the southern flank of Army Group North, which still occupied Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. With the front line collapsing to the south, the Red Army seized the initiative to push directly into the Baltic states. The opening phase of the Baltic offensive unfolded in late June and early July, beginning with deep Soviet penetrations toward Vilnius and the Daugava River. The First Baltic Front under General Ivan Bagramian spearheaded the initial movement. Comprising several combined arms armies, including the 4th Shock Army, 6th Guards Army, and 43rd Army, the front numbered more than 400,000 men, supported by approximately 1,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, and strong artillery formations. Their immediate objective was to capture Vilnius, the key road and rail hub linking Belarus with East Prussia and Latvia. The Germans recognized its importance and ordered the garrison, consisting of elements of the 3rd Panzer Army and local fortress troops, to hold at all costs. By the first week of July, Soviet armored spearheads had encircled Vilnius. The defenders, numbering about 20,000 soldiers, resisted fiercely, using fortified positions and urban strongpoints to delay the advance. The encirclement battle lasted from 7 to 13 July, with street fighting destroying much of the city. German attempts to break the encirclement, including relief efforts by the 5th Panzer Division, failed to reach the garrison. After days of combat, most of the German defenders were either killed or captured, while small groups managed to break out toward East Prussia. For the Red Army, the capture of Vilnius opened the way into Lithuania and severed key lines of communication for Army Group North. While Vilnius fell, Soviet forces pressed west and north toward the Daugava. The river was a natural defensive line and the last opportunity for the Germans to slow the advance before Riga. Army Group North committed its remaining reserves to reinforce bridgeheads and fortify crossings. Elements of the 16th and 18th Armies, numbering approximately 300,000 men, attempted to construct a continuous defense, but their strength had already been eroded by losses in Belarus and the need to transfer divisions to other collapsing sectors of the front. The Soviet assault across the Daugava came quickly. By mid-July, the Red Army forced crossings at several points, establishing bridgeheads despite determined German resistance. Heavy artillery barrages and coordinated air support from the Soviet Third Air Army suppressed German positions, allowing infantry to secure footholds on the western bank. German counterattacks, often supported by the remnants of panzer divisions, achieved local successes, but could not dislodge the Soviet bridgeheads. The Wehrmacht increasingly relied on hastily formed battle groups, composed of depleted divisions reinforced with Luftwaffe ground personnel and naval detachments withdrawn from ports. Civilians in Lithuania and Latvia were directly affected by the opening phase of the offensive. German authorities organized hurried evacuations of military installations, factories, and administrative offices. Tens of thousands of civilians fled westward with retreating columns, fearing reprisals or renewed Soviet occupation. Partisan movements, which had grown throughout 1943 and 1944, now intensified their activity, cutting communication lines and attacking isolated German units. In Vilnius and other liberated cities, Soviet partisans emerged from hiding to support the advancing Red Army, while nationalist groups also sought to assert their presence in the chaotic transition. By the end of July, the opening phase of the Baltic offensive had achieved significant territorial gains. The Soviet First Baltic Front had advanced more than 200 kilometers in a matter of weeks, capturing Vilnius, Kaunas, and much of central Lithuania. The German front lines were compressed into Latvia and Estonia, with Army Group North retreating under constant pressure. Although German forces still held Riga and Tallinn, their southern flank was. The rapid Soviet advance signaled that the campaign to drive the Wehrmacht from the Baltics had begun in earnest, and the struggle for control of the northern theater of the war was entering its decisive stage. As the Red Army consolidated its gains in Lithuania during July 1944, attention shifted to the broader strategic framework of the Baltic campaign. The Soviet High Command, the Stavka, considered the Baltic states not simply as territory to be retaken, but as a decisive theater where the northern flank of the German Eastern Front could be destroyed. The overarching plan called for the encirclement and elimination of Army Group North, which still fielded more than 30 divisions in Latvia and Estonia, totaling around 730,000 men. For Stalin and the Soviet leadership, the Baltic offensive had both military and political significance. It was designed to secure the Baltic coastline, reassert Soviet authority over territories annexed in 1940, and ensure the Red Army's advance into East Prussia would not be threatened from the north. The Soviet strategic goals were ambitious and clearly defined. The First Baltic Front under General Ivan Bagramian, supported by the Second and Third Baltic Fronts under Generals Andrei Eremenko and Ivan Maslenikov, would strike westward into Latvia and northward into Estonia. Their combined strength exceeded 1.5 million soldiers, equipped with nearly 3,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, more than 20,000 artillery pieces and mortars, and approximately 2,000 aircraft. Railway repair brigades and engineering units followed close behind the spearheads, tasked with restoring rail lines to keep the vast armies supplied. Soviet doctrine emphasized deep operations, breakthrough, encirclement, and exploitation, designed to prevent the Germans from forming new defensive lines. The German objectives were narrower but no less critical. Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner, was ordered to hold the Baltics at all costs. The German High Command and Hitler personally considered Riga, Liepāja, and Tallinn essential to maintaining naval operations in the Baltic Sea. U-boat training bases, naval shipyards, and supply depots located in these ports were vital for sustaining Kriegsmarine activity and for maintaining contact with Finland, which was still engaged in the continuation war against the Soviet Union. The Wehrmacht also sought to protect East Prussia from a northern approach, believing that a Soviet breakthrough into the Baltic states would open a direct corridor toward Königsberg. Logistics heavily influenced both plans. For the Red Army, the main challenge was distance, as Soviet supply trains had to advance rapidly behind the front, and every destroyed bridge, sabotaged railway, or mined road slowed the momentum. Fuel consumption was immense, with hundreds of tanks and trucks moving through narrow road networks. The Soviets compensated with dedicated railway troops who could restore track at a rate of several kilometers per day, enabling the constant delivery of ammunition, rations, and reinforcements. The Germans, by contrast, operated under severe shortages. Partisan activity across the Baltics disrupted communications, while Soviet air superiority made daylight rail movements hazardous. Supplies from East Prussia and Poland reached Army Group North irregularly, forcing commanders to ration fuel and ammunition. Propaganda accompanied these military preparations. Soviet announcements portrayed the offensive as the liberation of the Baltic peoples from fascist occupation. Posters, radio broadcasts, and speeches emphasized the return of Soviet power and the punishment of collaborators. For Germany, the propaganda line stressed the defense of Fortress Europe against Bolshevism. Local auxiliaries, including units recruited from Baltic populations, were mobilized in increasing numbers to bolster German defenses. These men were often placed in second-line roles or used for anti-partisan duties, freeing German units for frontline fighting. Intelligence assessments shaped expectations on both sides. The Soviets judged that Army Group North was vulnerable due to the collapse of Army Group Center to the south, which left its flank exposed. Reconnaissance flights and partisan reports confirmed that German reserves were limited and that defensive lines along the Daugava River were hastily constructed. The Germans, on the other hand, recognized the danger but were constrained by Hitler's orders forbidding large-scale withdrawals. Schörner was known for his strict discipline, even executing soldiers accused of retreating without orders, but his ability to maneuver strategically was restricted by directives from Berlin. By late July, the preparations had reached their peak. The Soviet fronts were aligned along the Daugava, their artillery massed and supply depots stocked. Airfields were crowded with aircraft ready to support the advance. Behind the lines, tank armies refitted after the fighting in Belarus prepared for renewed operations. The Germans, with fewer than 200 operational tanks and increasingly limited air support, dug defensive lines across Latvia and Estonia, hoping to delay the inevitable advance. The strategic goals and planning of the Baltic offensive thus set the stage for a decisive confrontation. The Red Army intended to use overwhelming numbers and coordinated deep operations to annihilate Army Group North, while the Germans sought to cling to vital ports and delay the Soviets long enough to protect East Prussia. The stage was set for the battles that would follow, a campaign marked by vast encirclements, desperate defensive stands, and the eventual isolation of an entire German army on the shores of the Baltic Sea. In the final week of July 1944, the Red Army struck across the Daugava River in multiple sectors, beginning the first major engagements of the Baltic offensive. The First Baltic Front's assault was supported by massed artillery barrages that pounded German defensive lines before infantry and armor surged forward. Soviet engineers built pontoon bridges under fire, enabling tanks and self-propelled guns to cross the wide river. Despite determined resistance from German units of the 16th Army, Soviet forces established bridgeheads that quickly expanded. The crossings at Jēkabpils and Krustpils in Latvia proved especially critical, allowing the Soviets to threaten Riga from the southeast and forcing the Wehrmacht into continuous retreat. One of the earliest and most significant confrontations came in the Battle of Šiauliai in northern Lithuania. Between 5 and 31st July, Soviet forces of the 43rd and 51st Armies advanced against German positions defended by the 3rd Panzer Army and the 16th Army. The Germans deployed several panzer divisions, including the 4th and 5th Panzer Divisions, to blunt the Soviet thrust. Fighting was intense, with German armored counterattacks temporarily halting Soviet progress. However, the Red Army committed additional mechanized corps and broke through, capturing Šiauliai and cutting German communications between Riga and East Prussia. This threatened to isolate large parts of Army Group North. In response, Hitler ordered immediate counterstrikes, including the commitment of the 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf. For several days, Soviet and German armor clashed across the Lithuanian countryside, but the Soviets retained control of the city and its vital road and rail junctions. Meanwhile, the German garrison in Vilnius, already encircled earlier in July, collapsed under relentless Soviet pressure. The battle left much of the city in ruins. The capture of Vilnius not only deprived Army Group North of a major stronghold, but also allowed the Soviets to coordinate further advances toward Kaunas and the Latvian border. Thousands of German soldiers were taken prisoner, while local civilians faced the destruction of their homes and infrastructure. For Lithuania, the battle marked the end of German occupation in the central regions, though fighting continued in the north and west. As the Soviets advanced into Latvia, the civilian population experienced a new wave. German authorities organized forced evacuations of administrative personnel and collaborators, while many families fled westward with retreating columns. Partisan activity increased dramatically in areas abandoned by German forces. In some regions, Soviet partisans clashed with nationalist groups who opposed both German occupation and Soviet return, creating a volatile and often violent environment. The population of Riga braced for combat as the Red Army drew closer, while German propaganda promised that the city would be held as a fortress. Morale on the German side deteriorated sharply during these first engagements. Reports from Army Group North described units reduced to half strength, divisions holding lines with as few as 4,000, 5,000 men, and shortages of ammunition and fuel that hampered counterattacks. Desertion and unauthorized withdrawals increased, prompting harsh measures from commanders. Field Marshal Schörner, newly appointed to command Army Group North, became notorious for his strict discipline, issuing orders that retreat without authorization would be punished by execution. Despite these measures, the Red Army's superiority in numbers and firepower made continued resistance costly and often futile. Soviet morale, by contrast, was buoyed by the rapid pace of success. The liberation of major Baltic cities was portrayed as the restoration of Soviet authority over territories annexed before the war. Soldiers were encouraged by propaganda that framed the offensive as both a military victory and a political act of liberation. Yet the fighting remained brutal and casualties mounted. In the battles of July and August 1944, the Red Army lost tens of thousands of men, particularly in armored clashes around Šiauliai and during river crossings under fire. Unexpected developments shaped. In mid-August, Soviet spearheads advancing north threatened to cut off all of Army Group North from East Prussia. The Germans launched a large counteroffensive known as Operation Doppelkopf, with the aim of re-establishing contact between Army Group North and Army Group Center. Supported by the Kriegsmarine and Luftwaffe, German panzer divisions launched surprise attacks near Tukums and along the Gulf of Riga. For a brief period, they succeeded in reopening a narrow corridor, allowing vital supplies and reinforcements to reach the trapped formations. Although the Soviets were forced to pull back in some sectors, the overall balance of the campaign remained in their favor. By late August 1944, the first engagements of the Baltic offensive had transformed the front. The Red Army had liberated most of Lithuania, established bridgeheads across the Daugava, and placed Army Group North in jeopardy of encirclement. German attempts to stabilize the front slowed, but did not stop the Soviet advance. Civilians endured the devastation of battle, mass evacuations, and reprisals. Partisan warfare escalated, further undermining German control. The stage was set for the next phase of the campaign, a full-scale escalation that would decide the fate of Riga, Estonia, and the German presence in the Baltics altogether. Through September 1944, the battles in the Baltic escalated into a crisis for both armies. After the summer advances, the Red Army pressed relentlessly against German positions in Latvia and Estonia. The 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Baltic fronts coordinated their operations, totaling more than 1 million men, supported by thousands of tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft. Their momentum carried them across northern Lithuania into central Latvia, threatening to sever Army Group North's communications entirely. For the Germans, Army Group North now comprised roughly 30 divisions, including the 16th and 18th Armies, but many formations were under strength, averaging 7,000, 8,000 men, where full divisions should have fielded more than 12,000. Shortages of fuel and ammunition grew acute, and yet Hitler's orders demanded holding every position regardless of circumstance. The advance toward Riga brought some of the heaviest fighting of the offensive. Soviet troops crossed the Daugava River at multiple points, forcing German defenders to withdraw toward the Latvian capital. By early September, Soviet spearheads reached the outskirts of Riga, and the city was declared a fortress. The German command poured reinforcements into the sector, including remnants of panzer divisions brought from other fronts. Urban fighting loomed, but Soviet operations were not confined to Riga alone. Other armies pushed north toward Estonia, aiming to capture. The crisis deepened with the involvement of local populations. Tens of thousands of civilians fled westward with retreating German columns, while others were caught in the path of the fighting. In Latvia and Estonia, nationalist groups viewed the Soviet advance with hostility, fearing renewed Soviet rule after 3 years of German occupation. Some continued to fight alongside German units or in independent formations, while Soviet partisans resumed attacks on German rear areas. Civilians suffered from bombardments, forced evacuations, and reprisals, while towns and villages along the front were destroyed in the crossfire. German attempts to restore the situation culminated in Operation Doppelkopf in mid-August and Operation Caesar in September. These counteroffensives aimed to re-establish secure contact between Army Group North and Army Group Center through the corridor near Tukums. Initially, German panzer divisions achieved some tactical successes, cutting into Soviet lines and reopening a land connection. Naval support from the Kriegsmarine in the Gulf of Riga and concentrated Luftwaffe sorties temporarily stabilized the situation, yet the gains were short-lived. Soviet forces quickly regrouped, reasserted control of the corridor, and pushed German units back. The failure to hold the link left Army Group North increasingly dependent on Baltic ports for supply and evacuation. As pressure mounted, Hitler issued directives forbidding the evacuation of Army Group North. He insisted that Riga, Tallinn, and Liepaja must be held as fortress cities to anchor the northern front. This rigid command structure prevented German generals from conducting flexible withdrawals to shorten their lines. Instead, they were compelled to defend exposed salients, where Soviet artillery and air power inflicted heavy losses. Divisions weakened by months of fighting were left with insufficient manpower to cover long defensive sectors. Reports from German Corps headquarters described battalions reduced to a few hundred men, often supported by ad hoc formations drawn from Luftwaffe personnel and naval detachments. The Soviet escalation included large-scale artillery preparations and concentrated airstrikes. Soviet air armies flew thousands of sorties to disrupt German logistics, bombing rail hubs, bridges, and ports. Tank armies were committed to break through defensive belts, while infantry divisions pressed forward in relentless assaults. By late September, the Red Army captured Tallinn after days of fighting, forcing the evacuation of German and Estonian units by sea. This loss deprived the Germans of a major naval base and closed the Gulf of Finland to their operations. Simultaneously, Soviet advances into northern Latvia severed many of the remaining land routes, tightening the noose around Army Group North. For the civilian population of the Baltic states, the crisis phase of the offensive was catastrophic. In Estonia, more than 70,000 people were evacuated by sea to Germany and occupied Denmark during September, while thousands more were left behind. In Latvia, Riga's population braced for siege as artillery fire drew closer. Farmers abandoned harvests in the fields, and infrastructure was systematically destroyed in retreating areas to deny resources to the Soviets. Reprisals against suspected collaborators and partisan supporters claimed thousands of lives. By early October 1944, the escalation of fighting had driven German forces back to the Courland Peninsula in western Latvia. The crisis phase of the Baltic offensive had ended in disaster for Army Group North. Though German counterattacks had briefly slowed the Red Army, the overwhelming Soviet strength in men, armor, and artillery forced a retreat that could no longer be reversed. The German High Command now faced the reality that its northern armies were isolated, trapped against the Baltic Sea, and cut off from East Prussia. For the Soviets, the crisis had culminated in decisive territorial gains, setting the stage for the final phase of the campaign and the destruction of German power in the region. By the autumn of 1944, the Baltic offensive reached its peak. After weeks of steady advances through Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, the Red Army concentrated overwhelming force to break the last German strongholds in the region. The 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Baltic fronts reinforced by elements of the Leningrad Front, deployed more than 1.5 million men, nearly 3,000 tanks and assault guns, 20,000 artillery. Against them stood Army Group North, reduced to about 30 divisions, but many at half strength, numbering perhaps 500,000, 550,000 men, with only a few hundred operational tanks and assault guns. Air support was minimal. Luftflotte 1 could muster fewer than 300 aircraft, a fraction of Soviet air strength. The Soviet command identified Riga as the principal objective. The Latvian capital was not only the largest city in the region, but also the main logistical hub for German forces. It served as a port for supplies, a rail center linking East Prussia to Estonia, and the seat of German administration in the Baltics. The operation to capture Riga began in late September 1944 with a massive artillery bombardment along the approaches to the city. Soviet air armies supported the offensive with round-the-clock sorties, striking rail lines. German troops of the 16th and 18th Armies attempted to hold a defensive line along the Daugava River, but relentless Soviet pressure forced them back step by step. By early October, Soviet spearheads had encircled parts of the German front east of Riga, cutting key roads and isolating forward units. German counterattacks, often mounted by ad hoc battle groups with a handful of tanks and assault guns, slowed the advance but could not reverse it. The Red Army pressed closer, with infantry storming suburbs and industrial zones while artillery rained shells into the city. On 13 October 1944, after days of fighting, Soviet forces entered Riga. The Germans withdrew westward under heavy pressure, destroying bridges and facilities as they retreated. The fall of Riga marked a decisive blow. Army Group North was severed from direct land contact with East Prussia and forced into retreat toward the Courland Peninsula. While Riga fell, Soviet armies also advanced in Estonia. Tallinn, already evacuated by German forces in September, was firmly secured by the Red Army, and naval operations closed the Gulf of Finland to German shipping. With Estonia lost, the last German units withdrew to islands in the Baltic Sea, where they continued limited resistance before evacuation. In Lithuania, Soviet control was consolidated, with Kaunas and Šiauliai firmly in Soviet hands. By mid-October, nearly all Baltic territory except western Latvia was under Red Army control. For the Germans, the retreat into Courland represented both a failure and a last chance to stabilize. Approximately 500,000 men of Army Group North crowded into the peninsula, establishing defensive lines around Liepāja and Ventspils. Hitler ordered these forces to hold the pocket, believing they could tie down Soviet armies and continue to control Baltic ports. Plans to evacuate the troops to reinforce other sectors were rejected, and the trapped formations were renamed Army. For the soldiers inside the pocket, the situation was precarious. Supply depended almost entirely on the Kriegsmarine, which ferried goods across the Baltic Sea under constant Soviet air and submarine attack. Civilian suffering reached its height during this peak phase. The battles for Riga and surrounding areas devastated infrastructure, destroyed housing, and displaced tens of thousands of residents. The German withdrawal included scorched earth tactics, with bridges blown up and facilities burned to deny use to the Soviets. Civilians caught in the path of retreat were either evacuated westward or left behind to face reprisals. In Latvia alone, thousands fled by sea to Germany and occupied Denmark. Those who remained endured the shelling of cities, shortages of food and fuel, and the immediate imposition of Soviet authority once areas were retaken. Soviet casualties in the peak battles were heavy. Estimates suggest that the Red Army lost more than 70,000 killed and wounded during the October offensives, with thousands of tanks and vehicles destroyed or damaged in urban and river crossings. German losses were also severe, particularly in Riga, where thousands were captured during the retreat and many more killed in the fighting. Yet the disparity in resources ensured that the Soviets could replace their losses quickly, while German units steadily withered. By the end of October 1944, the Baltic offensive had reached its maximum achievement. Riga had fallen, Estonia and Lithuania were firmly under Soviet control, and Army Group North was cut off in Courland. The German presence in the Baltic was reduced to a besieged enclave, unable to influence the wider. The peak of the campaign thus concluded with the decisive destruction of German operational capability in the Baltics. But it also marked the beginning of a prolonged struggle in Courland, where isolated German troops would continue to resist for months, even after the Red Army had turned its focus westward into East Prussia. Following the capture of Riga in October 1944, the Red Army shifted its attention to the Courland Peninsula, where the remnants of Army Group North had withdrawn. Renamed Army Group Courland, this force still numbered around 30 divisions, with approximately 500,000 soldiers, but their strategic situation was hopeless. Cut off from East Prussia and surrounded on land by the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Baltic fronts, the Germans relied almost entirely on naval supply routes across the Baltic Sea. Hitler ordered the pocket to be held, arguing that the troops could tie down large Soviet formations and maintain control of ports needed for U-boat training and evacuation routes. For the Red Army, the task was to eliminate this enclave without exhausting resources required for the offensive into East Prussia. The first Soviet attempts to crush the pocket began almost immediately. In late October 1944, the 1st and 2nd Baltic fronts launched assaults against German lines around Tukums and Liepaja. Massive artillery bombardments preceded infantry attacks, supported by tanks and close air support. German defenses, however, had been hastily fortified with trenches, bunkers, and minefields. Units of the 16th and 18th Armies repelled the assaults, inflicting heavy casualties. The flat terrain of western Latvia offered little cover, exposing Soviet infantry to concentrated fire. The Red Army gained some ground but failed to achieve a decisive breakthrough. Through November and December, further offensives were launched. Soviet armies attempted to cut the pocket in half by striking towards. Each attack began with overwhelming artillery preparation, often involving thousands of guns, and followed with coordinated tank and infantry pushes. German commanders responded by shifting reserves rapidly along interior lines, concentrating forces where the attacks fell heaviest. Luftwaffe units, though greatly diminished, provided occasional support, while naval guns from German ships offshore shelled Soviet positions. The Soviets made local gains, capturing villages and inflicting losses, but the Germans held their core defensive zones. The winter of 1944-45 brought no relief. Temperatures dropped, roads turned to ice, and supply difficulties mounted for both sides. For the Germans, reliance on sea transport became increasingly precarious. Soviet submarines and aircraft attacked. Vehicles were immobilized, forcing greater reliance on horses and manpower. Nevertheless, the Wehrmacht maintained discipline, constructing deeper defensive belts and preparing fallback lines. Hitler's refusal to evacuate the pocket condemned the troops to isolation, but also ensured that the Red Army had to commit substantial resources to contain them. For the Soviets, the problem was one of cost versus necessity. Eliminating Army Group Courland outright would require repeated large-scale offensives and potentially tens of thousands of casualties. Stavka decided on a strategy of containment combined with periodic assaults to weaken the defenders. Between October 1944 and April 1945, 6 major Soviet offensives were launched against the pocket. None succeeded in breaking it completely, though each reduced the German perimeter and inflicted losses. The Germans, despite being outnumbered and outgunned, maintained a shrinking but solid defensive enclave. Local civilians endured constant hardship. Western Latvia was devastated by months of fighting. Villages were destroyed by artillery, fields left uncultivated, and populations displaced. Thousands fled westward in German-organized evacuations by sea, while others were trapped in the contested zone. Soviet reoccupation of captured areas brought deportations of suspected collaborators and renewed partisan activity. Families were divided as some members were evacuated with retreating Germans while others remained under Soviet control. Resistance movements also adapted. Soviet partisans in Latvia and Estonia intensified sabotage operations, targeting German supply depots and communication lines inside the pocket. At the same time, nationalist partisans hostile to Soviet rule prepared to continue armed struggle after the Germans' defeat. The Baltic countryside thus became a zone of overlapping conflicts, with civilians caught. By early 1945, the Courland Pocket had become a sideshow in the wider war, but one with significant implications. For Germany, 500,000 troops were immobilized, unable to reinforce collapsing fronts in East Prussia or the Reich. For the Soviets, the containment of such a large force tied down armies that might otherwise have been committed elsewhere. Nevertheless, the Red Army maintained pressure to prevent breakout attempts or evacuation. The resistance and adaptation of both sides in Courland illustrated the endurance of armies under extreme conditions. German divisions, many reduced to 3,000, 4,000 men, continued to fight with cohesion, shifting along interior lines and exploiting fortified terrain. The Soviets, learning from earlier costly assaults, increasingly emphasized encirclement tactics, artillery superiority, and psychological warfare, including leaflet drops urging surrender. Morale fluctuated on both sides, but thus, after the peak victories of autumn 1944, the campaign settled into a grinding struggle on the Courland Peninsula. The Germans resisted stubbornly, hoping for political developments or evacuation that never came, while the Soviets adapted by containing rather than annihilating the pocket. This phase revealed the limits of offensive momentum and the persistence of defenders even in hopeless circumstances, setting the stage for the final months of the war in the Baltic theater. By the spring of 1945, the Courland Pocket represented the final stage of the Baltic campaign and the decisive turning point for the remnants of Army Group North. Having been renamed Army Group Courland in January, the force remained isolated in western Latvia, numbering between 200,000 and 220,000 men after months of attrition. Its divisions were under strength, with regiments reduced to the size of battalions and equipment increasingly scarce. Supplies still arrived by sea, but the Kriegsmarine faced growing difficulties. Soviet submarines and aircraft intensified attacks against convoys in the Baltic, sinking transport ships and tankers, which further strained the logistical system. The German soldiers inside the pocket were increasingly aware that their situation was untenable. For the Red Army, the turning point lay not in the outright destruction of the pocket, but in the decision to prioritize other fronts. By early 1945, the Stavka shifted its focus toward the Vistula Oder and East Prussian offensives, aiming directly at Berlin. The Soviet leadership concluded that eliminating Army Group Courland completely was not worth the heavy casualties it would require. Instead, 6 offensives between October 1944 and April 1945 gradually reduced the German perimeter, but full eradication was never achieved. Containment became the guiding principle. Entire Soviet armies were tasked with encircling the Germans, blocking breakout attempts, and denying them freedom of maneuver. Despite this, the Germans did not collapse immediately. Under the command of Colonel General Lothar Rendulic, Army Group Courland reorganized its defensive belts into multiple lines around Liepāja and Ventspils. Improvised strongpoints, bunkers, and minefields were constructed to delay Soviet assaults. German troops fought with determination, knowing surrender meant captivity and uncertain survival. Yet morale varied. Some soldiers continued to obey orders strictly, while others sought ways to avoid combat or longed for evacuation. Reports from within the pocket indicate growing desertion, shortages of food, and reliance on horses for transport as fuel supplies dwindled. The Soviet turning point came with the fall. Once the northern flank of the Reich had been destroyed, the Courland garrison had no strategic value. Soviet offensives in March and April tightened the noose, compressing German lines into a small coastal enclave, but Stavka ordered no further large-scale assaults. Instead, Soviet commanders waited for the inevitable surrender following the defeat of the Reich itself. By this time, Army Group Courland was unable to influence events beyond its perimeter, and its troops were immobilized in defensive positions, cut off from any possibility of reinforcement. For civilians in the region, the turning point meant a final wave of upheaval. Thousands were evacuated by German ships to East Prussia and Denmark in late 1944 and early 1945. But as Soviet naval forces increased their activity, such movements became perilous. The sinking of transport vessels caused heavy civilian and military casualties at sea. Those who remained in western Latvia endured constant bombardment, requisitions, and shortages. Farms and villages were destroyed, and many residents faced reprisals either from retreating Germans or advancing Soviets. By late April 1945, the Courland pocket had ceased to play any operational role in the war. Hitler, however, continued to demand its defense, insisting the garrison tie down Soviet forces. This directive condemned nearly 250,000 men to futility. When Germany officially capitulated on 8 May 1945, Army Group Courland was included in the unconditional surrender. On 9th May, Soviet forces began the orderly collection of German prisoners, disarming divisions that had fought in isolation for nearly 7 months. Between 200,000 and 220,000 soldiers marched into captivity, many of them destined for years of labor in Soviet camps. The turning point of the Baltic offensive thus came not in a single decisive battle, but in the encirclement and immobilization of Army Group Courland. The fall of Riga, Tallinn, and Vilnius had already determined the campaign's outcome. The survival of the German pocket was only temporary. For the Soviets, it meant a secure northern flank and full control of the Baltic coastline, enabling the final drive into Germany. For the Germans, it marked the transformation of a fighting force into an isolated remnant condemned to resist without hope of relief. The Baltic theater, once central to the Wehrmacht's northern strategy, had been reduced to a besieged enclave awaiting surrender. By May 1945, the Baltic offensive had already achieved its essential objectives, and what remained in Courland was the closing chapter of combat operations in the region. After the fall of East Prussia and the advance of the Red Army into central Germany, the German divisions trapped in western Latvia were strategically irrelevant. Army Group Courland, numbering between 200,000 and 220,000 men, was compressed into a small coastal enclave around Liepāja, Ventspils, and several inland defensive belts. Its troops had endured 6 Soviet offensives since October 1944, each narrowing the perimeter, but failing to annihilate the pocket entirely. By the final weeks of the war, their situation was hopeless, yet Hitler's directives still insisted on holding the line. The end of combat operations began with Germany's unconditional surrender signed at Reims on 7th May and ratified in Berlin on 8th May 1945. Soviet commanders received confirmation that Army Group Courland was included in the capitulation order. On 9th May, Red Army units of the 1st German formations, which had spent months reinforcing bunkers and trenches, were ordered by their commanders to cease resistance. Columns of soldiers marched to designated assembly areas where Soviet officers supervised the collection of weapons, equipment, and vehicles. The surrender was carried out with remarkable scale. In total, more than 200,000 German troops laid down their arms, including members of the 16th and 18th Armies, Luftwaffe ground personnel, Kriegsmarine detachments, and local auxiliary units. Soviet reports recorded the capture of hundreds of tanks, assault guns, and artillery pieces, along with vast stockpiles of ammunition that had been hoarded during the months of siege. The operation was one of the largest mass capitulations on the Eastern Front. Unlike earlier encirclements where combat ended in destruction, the Courland surrender was more orderly, reflecting the broader collapse of the Reich. The immediate consequences for the German soldiers were grim. Prisoners were marched to improvised camps under Soviet guard, often with little food or shelter. From there, many were transported by rail to prison camps deep inside the Soviet Union. Estimates suggest that tens of thousands remained in captivity for years, with mortality rates high due to disease, hunger, and forced labor conditions. officers were separated from enlisted men, and those accused of war crimes faced summary tribunals. For the rank and file, surrender marked the end of prolonged isolation, but the beginning of uncertain survival in Soviet hands. For the Red Army, the capture of Army Group Courland was a significant achievement, even if it came after the main battles in Germany had ended. It eliminated the last organized German resistance in the Baltic region and secured the coastline fully for Soviet use. Ports such as Liepaja and Ventspils, once critical for the Kriegsmarine, were now under Soviet control. Naval bases were quickly re-established to support the Baltic Fleet, which had been largely confined to Leningrad and Kronstadt for much of the war. The elimination of German forces also freed Soviet divisions for demobilization or redeployment, although many were kept in the region to secure post-war occupation. The civilian consequences of the withdrawal and surrender were immediate. Thousands of Latvian and Estonian civilians who had remained in the Courland region now faced Soviet reoccupation. Families that had fled west with the Kriegsmarine evacuations earlier in 1944 were separated from those who stayed behind. The population endured reprisals against suspected collaborators, and Soviet security services quickly moved to suppress nationalist resistance. Deportations resumed, targeting not only those who had served in German auxiliary units, but also political opponents and intellectuals. Entire communities faced the reality of integration once more into the Soviet system, accompanied by loss of independence and strict political control. The physical devastation in Courland was extensive. Months of fighting had destroyed farmland, villages, and infrastructure. Trenches and minefields scarred the landscape, while artillery bombardments left towns in ruins. Transportation networks required rebuilding, but Soviet priorities focused first on securing military installations and re-establishing state administration. For local populations, the end of combat did not immediately bring relief. Shortages of food, fuel, and medical supplies continued well into the post-war months. In broader terms, the surrender in Courland symbolized the futility of Hitler's hold at all costs directives. For months, 500,000 German troops had been immobilized in a region that no longer had strategic relevance. These forces might have bolstered defenses in East Prussia, the Oder Line, or even Berlin, but instead they fought a campaign of attrition with no hope of relief. By May 1945, the result was inevitable. Their capitulation became one of the final acts of the Second World War in Europe. The aftermath of the Courland surrender thus combined military finality with humanitarian crises. Hundreds of thousands of German soldiers entered captivity, while Baltic civilians faced the harsh reality of renewed Soviet control. The devastation of the countryside, coupled with mass displacement and political reprisals, marked the beginning of a new chapter for the region. Combat operations had ended, but the consequences of the Baltic offensive were only beginning to unfold in the lives of those who had lived through it. The Baltic offensive of 1944-1945 left behind a legacy that shaped both the final stages of the Second World War and the post-war political landscape of northeastern Europe. Militarily, the operation demonstrated the Red Army's ability to execute deep, coordinated offensives that combined multiple fronts, mechanized forces, artillery, and air power. Over the course of several months, the Soviet Union committed more than 1.5 million men, supported by thousands of tanks, guns, and aircraft, to the liberation of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. The result was the destruction of Army Group North as an effective fighting formation, the capture of Riga, Tallinn, and Vilnius, and the eventual isolation of more than 200,000 German troops in the Courland pocket. The strategic significance of the operation was considerable. By driving to the Baltic Sea, the Red Army severed the connection between Army Group North and Army Group Center, cutting off a substantial portion of the Wehrmacht and denying Germany the use of Baltic ports. This deprived the Kriegsmarine of bases that had supported U-boat training, naval construction, and convoy operations. It also eliminated the possibility of Germany using the Baltics as a springboard for operations with Finland, which by September 1944 had signed an armistice with the Soviet Union. The Soviet capture of the Baltic coastline secured the northern flank of their advance into East Prussia and opened the way for operations that would eventually push into the heart of Germany. For Germany, the campaign was a costly defeat. Army Group North, once a formidable force, was reduced to a trapped garrison. Hitler's refusal to authorize evacuation condemned hundreds of thousands of soldiers to months of futile resistance. The immobilization of such a large force in Courland deprived other sectors, particularly East Prussia and Berlin, of reinforcements at a critical stage of the war. While the Baltic campaign illustrated the consequences of rigid command decisions and the exhaustion of Germany's resources by late 1944. The political consequences for the Baltic states were profound. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, which had briefly experienced German occupation following Soviet annexation in 1940, now found themselves once again under Soviet control. The Red Army presented the offensive as a liberation, and Soviet propaganda celebrated the restoration of Soviet power. However, for many inhabitants of the Baltic states, the return of the Red Army meant repression, mass deportations, and the suppression of independence movements. Tens of thousands of people were arrested or exiled to Siberia in the years following 1945, while nationalist partisans launched armed resistance against Soviet authorities. The Baltic offensive thus marked not only the end of German occupation, but also the beginning of renewed Soviet rule that would last until the collapse of the U.S. The humanitarian cost of the campaign was enormous. Cities such as Riga, Tallinn, Vilnius, and Kaunas suffered widespread destruction from artillery bombardments and street fighting. Infrastructure across the countryside was devastated by months of combat and scorched earth retreats. Hundreds of thousands of civilians were displaced, either fleeing westward with retreating German columns or facing forced evacuations and reprisals once the Soviets reoccupied the territory. German and Baltic civilians evacuated by sea often faced perilous journeys under attack from Soviet submarines and aircraft. Those who remained endured shortages, reprisals, and the uncertainty of life under shifting occupation. The historical significance of the Baltic offensive has been debated in later decades. Soviet historiography emphasized it as a liberation campaign that completed the defeat of fascist forces in northeastern Europe and restored the Baltic republics to the Soviet. In Baltic national memory, however, it represented the replacement of one occupation with another and the loss of independence for nearly half a century. German military historians later pointed to the operation as an example of how Hitler's refusal to allow strategic withdrawals trapped and wasted valuable divisions. Western scholars have highlighted the offensive as one of the clearest demonstrations of Soviet operational art and the doctrine of deep operations, executed on a massive scale. Commemoration of the campaign has varied. In Soviet times, memorials were erected in Vilnius, Riga, and Tallinn to honor the Red Army soldiers who fell in the battles. The Adjimushkai quarries in Kerch and the Courland region itself became symbolic sites of sacrifice and endurance. After 1991, independent Baltic states reassessed these events, removing many Soviet-era monuments and reframing the narrative around the theme of dual occupation, German and Soviet. The memory of deportations, partisans, and political repression came to dominate national accounts, while the military battles themselves were placed within the broader context of lost independence. In the broader history of the Second World War, the Baltic Offensive stands as one of the decisive Soviet campaigns of 1944. Alongside Operation Bagration and the offensives in Ukraine and Poland, it completed the destruction of German defensive power in the east and secured the Soviet advance into German territory. The push to the sea isolated Army Group Courland, deprived Germany of critical resources, and reshaped the political destiny of the Baltic region. Its legacy was thus twofold: a demonstration of Soviet military power at its height, and the beginning of a long period of Soviet domination over the Baltic states, remembered very differently by those who fought and those who endured its aftermath.